Welcome to the Wednesday Honors Luncheon series.
And then we can talk. I'll always tantalize the classroom with clips as sort of a good strategy. The name of the book that I wrote is called Hollywood and Hitler, 1933-1939. And I had sort of two questions that I wanted to explore in the book. The first question is, how do you, if you're at Hollywood in the 1930s, how do you deal with an industry and a people that you've had fairly congenial relationships with since the end of the First World War, throughout the 1920s? Relationships of business, of art, in some cases of blood, because Carl Laemmle, the head of Universal Pictures, appoints his nephew, a German citizen, to be head of Universal Pictures in Germany. The Hollywood moguls visited the studios in Berlin. The Berlin filmmakers visited the Hollywood studios. They knew each other. They had really tight connections. And so what does this industry do when the sane, rational Germans on January 30th, 1933 suddenly become pathological? How do you deal with that? And what I did not want to do when I traced this story from 33 to 39 is to look back with kind of retrospective vision and say, oh, you should have seen this coming, at this moment in time. I really wanted to sort of like capture the ongoing story by using the trade press, people's memoirs at the time, the letters at the time, not stuff they wrote 30, 40 years later, which can be a little clouded by retrospective vision, to sort of trace what really I thought became a very poignant story of a lot of people kind of not believing what they were seeing in 1933, 1934. And especially, again, I really want to emphasize that these people knew each other very well. That is, the Hollywood moguls knew the Germans, both Jewish and Gentile, as sane businessmen. They also knew the German film industry as the only industry on the planet that could compete with Hollywood as art and entertainment. There was really no other competitor to Hollywood in the 1920s except German. And some of you probably know those great German expressionist films like The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari or Metropolis. And the moguls will... What?
M,
yeah. And the moguls would look at these films and know that these guys were as good as we were. And so being Hollywood moguls, the first thing they did was try to buy out the competition. So the best example might be the German filmmaker Ernst Lubitsch, who basically defects in the 1920s when the studios offer him more money than he's ever seen in his life, better technology in the Hollywood studios, and California, right, which is sort of an unbeatable deal for a German in 1923 or 24. Right? So that's sort of one question. The other question I had is, how does Nazism, which is so alive in our motion picture memory today, right? From films from Casablanca to Inglourious Basterds, right? I mean, how many images of Nazism are in your heads? Or Monuments Men, which is playing right now. All the documentaries you've seen on the History Channel or in universities, or for your entertainment on Netflix, wherever. Nazism is it's hard to think of an ideology that is more present in the movies and whose iconography and signature, flags and slogans and marches, the mise-en-scène, the montage, is more present in motion pictures. And I wanted to find out, well, what did we know about Nazism as it was growing in the 1930s? And again, not to have that infected with retrospective vision, because typically what documentaries started doing in World War II and forever after is they would look back and collect film footage from, say, the rise of Germany in 1933, move it on up to 39, and it would be kind of a linear progress. In the documentary during World War II, particularly Frank Capra's documentaries, the Why We Fight series, some of you might have seen in one of your classes, Capra kind of tells a story of the rise of Germany happening as America is asleep. And then in Munich in 1938, at the time when we could have stopped Hitler, we didn't. Aggression undeterred is aggression encouraged, and the war that we are fighting now in 1942-43 is because of this singular train. Now, of course, when you're in the middle of this, you're experiencing history as one damn thing after another. You don't know where it's going to end. Now, I know this is sort of self-evident, but people always seem to forget it. We forget that the Nazis of our imagination, both in the motion picture screen and the horrors that they committed in World War II, did not happen in the 1930s. If you had frozen the clock on September 1st, 1939, Adolf Hitler was still an underachiever when it came to mass slaughter. By then, the Chinese had slaughtered 1 million Japanese. Hundreds of thousands of people on both sides were killed in the Spanish-American War. We really don't know how many people Stalin killed. Hitler, by most estimates, had killed around 10,000 people by September 1st, 1939. Okay? So the Hitler of our imagination is not this guy in the 1930s. And one of the things as an historian I really wanted to do in both tracks, that is the business track and the sort of the imagination track, is to find out what happened at the time. And in brief, some of the studios make compromises. MGM, Paramount, Fox stay in Germany until the very end. Warner Brothers gets out early, in 33 basically. Universal, RKO, they all kind of leave. So it depended on the studio, the decision you'd make. So some studios continued doing business with the Nazis. When the Nazis say fire your Jewish personnel in your Berlin office, Warner Brothers tells them to take a hike. MGM says, okay, we'll make an accommodation. And they take the Gentiles in Madrid and transfer them to Berlin, and take the Jews in Berlin and transfer them out. And that's what MGM just decides to do. And they sort of maintain that relationship really up until the outbreak of war in Europe in 1939. Now, in terms of the motion picture imagery of Nazism, it's also an interesting story. Again, the newsreels in our minds that are so vivid about the rise of Germany in the 1930s, with I think two exceptions, were not seen or shown to audiences in America in the 1930s. And you have to, I think, be a little sympathetic to the newsreels here, even though they were kind of a timorous medium. They were always afraid of public controversy. And this is very difficult to imagine today in an age of smartphones, when everybody has a little camera in their smartphone, their Android or their iPad, that every frame of film that got out of Nazi Germany in the 30s had to be approved by Joseph Goebbels. So if you're a newsreel editor in New York, you've got to decide whether you're going to use Goebbels footage to illustrate your story about the rise of Germany, or not use anything. And so they had a really difficult time in deciding how much to cover and how to cover it. And also, in the 1930s, exhibitors did not want audiences to be upset before the main feature. If you went to the movies in the 1930s, you saw a cartoon, or newsreel at the top, a cartoon, a short film, then the feature film. And audiences came for the feature usually, and exhibitors did not want to disturb the audience who had paid their hard-earned 25 cents in the middle of the Great Depression to get upset by this nasty news from Germany. And sometimes that news would inspire fights in the theater. So if Hitler came on screen, there might be sort of some pro-Nazi in the audience who would applaud. The Jewish guy next to him would start a fight. Exhibitors just don't want any part of that. So in 1938, Life magazine mentions that there's a virtual embargo on images of Hitler in the newsreel screen. So if you're a scholar and you go back and look at the newsreel footage that maybe the National Archives has, that doesn't mean audiences actually saw it, because in the 30s, every exhibitor had a flatbed editing system in his projection booth, and they just cut it out. So there was very little of this stuff seen, with two exceptions in the 1930s, which Goebbels permitted to be filmed because he thought audiences internationally would approve. And of course they didn't, to his surprise. And these images are kind of emblazoned in our memory, and they were actually kind of widely seen in the 30s, because they very quickly became metonymy for what Germany meant. Right? And I bet when I mention these images, you'll unspool them in your head. The first image is of the boycott of Jewish stores on April 1st, 1933. And these images were widely seen in America of brown shirts in trucks, kind of marauding through the streets of Berlin, not broken shop windows quite yet, but there's a famous still image of a skull and crossbones that says "Attention Jews" in German. You know, "Achtung Juden," right? Is that image like in your head? You see it all the time in documentary cinema. And that's one of the few iconic images of the rise of Nazism that Americans would have seen in the 1930s. The other image happens on May 10th, 1933. And it happened throughout Germany, but the motion picture images that are in our heads. And again, this becomes such, you know, a classic kind of shorthand for what Nazi Germany is all about. And do you guys know the image I'm talking about? What would be the sort of the second most powerful image of the it's sort of an image both of what Germany has become, and also when we see it today, it's a flash forward to the conflagration to come. Yeah.
The military marches.
The what?
The military marches.
Not the marches, although we did see some of that in the newsreels as well. But this was sort of a fiery image. What? The book burning? Okay. Did somebody say that and I just didn't hear it? On May 10th, 1933, there were celebrated book burnings throughout Nazi Germany, but there was one in Berlin where Goebbels actually appears. And you see the images of brown shirts tossing in volumes, but usually by Jewish writers, but not all Jewish writers, Thomas Mann as well. And a huge bonfire. And that sort of shows so there's the suppression of freedom of speech, the conflagration to come. Those are sort of the two images, I think, that newsreel audiences would have seen in the 1930s, but by and large, not too much. The other thing that sort of becomes another tributary, and then I promise to show you a clip, is how are Jews portrayed on screen in the 1930s? Because by their very nature, Jews raised the issue of Nazism in Hollywood cinema in the 1930s, right? Because anybody watching the image is going to think of the obvious opposition in Nazi Germany. Now, throughout the 1920s and early 1930s, Jews appeared on the Hollywood screen. I wouldn't say with regularity, but probably out of proportion to their numbers in the population. Part of this is because of the power of Jewish entertainers in vaudeville. They go out to Hollywood. They can do their shtick on screen as well as they can do it in burlesque. So you're seeing images of urban Jewry on the screen, the same way you're seeing images of Italians and the Irish. And Warner Brothers is particularly out in front with the first sound film in 1927, The Jazz Singer, which I'm sure you've all seen and it's probably shown around Yeshiva a lot. That this film is sort of the all-American story of Jewish assimilation, which just happens to be the first powerful sound film. So you see Jews in the late 1920s, and you see them throughout the early 1930s when sound comes in and fast-talking comics like Groucho Marx get entree into the Hollywood screen. Right? Beginning in 1933-34, however, the Jew basically disappears quad Jew on the Hollywood screen for most of that decade. There's a lot of reasons why and a lot of debate about why, but two quick reasons are, of course, anytime you have a Jewish character in a Hollywood film, you know it's not going to get into Germany. So an identifiable Jewish character is going to basically deep six any film that you want to get into Germany. That's one reason. The other reason is an ironic reason, is that in 1934 the production code comes in. And the production code is the Hollywood regime of self-censorship done at the source. It's not government censorship, but it's kind of a cartel way of self-regulation, similar to the standards the American Bar Association or the American Medical Association has. And the Hollywood moguls get together and say, we'll regulate, i.e. censor our own cinema, and you guys in the government don't have to do it. Right? And one of the things the production code says is that the people of all nations should be respected. And what that means is that you can't really make fun of people anymore the way you could in the early 30s. Now, to our eyes, Hollywood cinema can sometimes seem a litany of stereotypes. But in the context of the time, Hollywood cinema is a lot better than vaudeville, burlesque, the comic papers, some of the pulp fiction, in its portrayal of various ethnic groups. So one of the consequences of the code and the consequences of the rise of Nazi Germany is the Jew on screen tends to disappear. So I want to just show you two quick images of maybe of a 1934 film. And I believe, and it's always dangerous to say this is the last time the word Jew appears on the Hollywood screen in the 1930s until 1940.
In Germany or
what?
In Germany or here?
In America.
Right.
In America. Yeah. I suppose in Germany it appeared, but only as a slur, right? Yeah. And you would have heard this in the late 20s and in the early sound era. But I think this is the last time you hear it. This is sort of the beginning of an MGM film called Manhattan Melodrama. It's about two boys who grow up. One becomes a gangster, one becomes a district attorney. They're in love with the same woman. You've seen this movie, you know how it ends. And it's based on a true story you New Yorkers might know from the turn of the last century. It was the biggest mass disaster in New York history until 9/11. A steamship called the General Slocum blew up and killed like 500 people, 400 or 500 people. And this is sort of the beginning scene of that, where you see sort of the wreckage of this disaster. Where are we here? Hopefully.
Blackie. Oh, Jim. Don't cry, Blackie. But Mom, she, I know. Mine too. And Bob. Oh, Jim. Don't you cry either. Oh.
My little son.
Are you Morris's father? He was a swell kid.
Yeah, he was a swell kid.
My mother and father, Blackie's mother, they...
Oh, you poor boys. What are your names?
My name's Edward Gallagher, but they call me Blackie, and he's Jim Wade.
Yeah, I knew your parents very well. And now, Blackie, and you, Jim, you have no place to go, eh?
No, we'll find someplace. They have regular homes for orphans.
No, they are not homes. How would you like to come and live with me? In my home, eh? And be my sons.
But I'm not a Jew, and neither is Jim.
Catholic, Protestant, Jew. What does it matter now?
Catholic, Protestant, Jew, what does it matter now? Well, it matters, and it's going to matter for the next few years. And you will see characters who the discerning, sophisticated, urban American in the 1930s will be able to recognize as Jewish, but there's really no kind of moment that says he's Jewish or recognizes his Jewishness in the film. So there are films like Make Way for Tomorrow in 1937, where the really nice guy, the sweet shopkeeper, is played by a Jewish-typed actor, and he kind of maybe might mutter a phrase even in Yiddish, but he's really not kind of valorized as Jewish in any overt way. And this goes on throughout the 1930s. There are a few little exceptions, but by and large, the production code, in agreement with the Anti-Defamation League, wants to keep overt, explicit Jewishness off the screen because it might be seen as incendiary. And let me show you sort of the lengths to which some studios can go to affect this. And actually, in the context of the time, this is sort of a daring move. And this is the 1937 biopic starring Paul Muni, the great Yiddish stage actor, called The Life of Emile Zolar. And one of the great moments in the life of Emile Zolar is what? Yeah, the Dreyfus. Yeah, right, J'accuse. And that basically takes up the last half of the film. And of course, this is a very dramatic moment where Dreyfus courageously goes against the French establishment and the French military to defend the injustice being done to this French captain purely because he's Jewish. Well, how do you let audiences know that anti-Semitism is at the core of this great, or of the persecution of Dreyfus and of the courage of Emile Zolar? This is the way they do it. If you blink, you will miss it. So please attend very carefully to this moment in the life of Emile Zolar. This is a little loud.
A confounded novel.
Terence et de Billy.
No.
Dreyfus.
You found something, Colonel?
I was just wondering about Esterhazy. Ferdinand Count Belsin Esterhazy. He's a foreigner.
Foreigner?
Yes. He's of Hungarian descent.
But his father was a general in the French army. Besides, Esterhazy's an infantry officer. The man who wrote that bordereau's a gunner.
Gunner. But this fellow here, Dreyfus, Alfred.
I wonder how he ever became a member of the general's staff.
That's,
So if you look down to munch your pizza, you probably missed it, right? Yeah. And that's, I think, the only time the word Jew appears on the Hollywood screen in the 1930s like this, where the audience is sort of like cued to it, but very briefly, almost in a kind of embarrassment, that you have to sort of not explicitly, but at least you have to signal to the audience that this is what's going on. By 1938, things start changing. 38 is really the key year in the American imagination of Nazism. That is the year in which America's vision finally looks across the Atlantic and sees what's going on in Germany. The previous years, it's not like America doesn't have its own problems with the Great Depression, right? But 38, the news becomes so dangerous, so lethal, so dramatic. The momentum of Hitler becomes so urgent and unavoidable that the American eyes finally start noting what is going on. And the three events, of course, are the annexation of Austria in March, the Anschluss, the invasion of Czechoslovakia, or basically the annexation of the Sudetenland in September of 1938 after the Munich Pact, and then Kristallnacht on the night of November 9th, 1938. And those events cumulatively direct American attention at what is going on in Europe, and spontaneously, the U.S. government has like nothing to do with this, but spontaneously, all across American popular culture, movies, radio, sports events, Americans begin reasserting their patriotism, reasserting their faith in democracy, giving public thanks to what we in America have that they are not having in Europe at the moment. The most famous bellwether of this is probably happens on November 11th, 1938, when Kate Smith is going on radio to do a variety show which will commemorate the 20th anniversary of the armistice, the end of the First World War. And Kate Smith, in these dark times with the cloud of, fascism descending over Europe, she thinks there's no better time for us Americans to kind of celebrate what we have here in a patriotic manner. And she wants a special song that will kind of symbolize this. So she turns to her very good friend Irving Berlin and asks for a song that will kind of really express what we Americans are all feeling. And do you have anything, Irving? And Irving says, well, I do have this song. I cut it out of a play back in World War I. Play was running a little long, had to cut the song. I always thought the song was kind of good. And maybe you could debut it on your radio show when we commemorate the armistice. And that song is God Bless America, right? And it electrifies the nation. It sells more sheet music than any song ever. For the rest of her life, every time Kate Smith makes a public appearance, she has to sing that song. Right? You guys probably are too young, but if you're of my generation or yours, anytime Kate Smith would appear at a variety show, she'd have to sing God Bless America. This is also the time when the national anthem starts getting played before sports events. We still have that legacy at baseball games. And movie theaters would also do it. At the beginning of of the motion picture program, there'd be a trailer of the Star Spangled Banner. And that tradition was kept with television up until the age of cable TV, because this is, again, you guys probably don't remember this unless you're of a certain age.
And they'd sign off at the end for the TV.
Where did you ever see that?
My family's from Albany, New York.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Pre-cable or
11.
Right. Yeah. Okay. And so that tradition, started in 1938, the end of that kind of key year, and then the next year you have films like Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. Like there's just this resurgence of, and I really do think the government has nothing to do with it, of kind of this natural, this felt sense that America is, got to get its backbone in line for this war that's coming. And Hollywood is also tentatively making steps in asserting democratic tolerance. And even Warner Brothers, and I say even because they're usually behind the curve on this, starts doing this in some of its films. And let me just maybe conclude with a clip that can lead us into maybe talking about the Second World War if you want. This is from a 1938 film called Boys Town, with Spencer Tracy as Father Flanagan, who was sort of this guy who created a community for orphan boys in the Midwest. And Mickey Rooney, again, who was in the earlier clip, kind of plays the tough kid coming into Boys Town, and he's too cool and cynical and tough to fall for Father Flanagan's talk of peace and love. And so this is Mickey Rooney's introduction to the community of orphan boys at Boys Town.
Hello, Your Honor. Finished your tour?
The bell saved it, didn't it, buddy?
Whitey, you're sitting beside me.
All right, have fun.
Thank you, Lord. These are gifts which we have received from the merciful God.
Heavenly Father, I thank you for this food.
Gracious God, may the food that we are about to receive strengthen our bodies.
What's the matter? Can't you all learn the same words?
Don't have to. You say the kind of grace you want to say.
At Boys Town, everybody worships as they please. Think the way they want it.
Sure, some of us don't have to go to chapel.
If you're a Catholic or a Protestant, you can go right on being nothing.
Well, I'm nothing.
Then you can go right on being nothing, and nobody cares.
Right.
Now, when you hear that kid, when he goes, you can be a Catholic, Protestant, you kind of are waiting for him to say Jew, right? Yeah. We're just not there yet. But on the other hand, it's like unmistakable, isn't it? You got a guy with a yarmulke saying the Hebrew prayer, he's fairly clearly Jewish, and it's also fairly clearly a acceptance of the great American rainbow of religions here. In fact, what's more startling in that scene when they do the montage of the different modes of worship is there's one guy there who's not worshiping at all. And atheism is a lot worse than Judaism in Hollywood in the 1930s. And I'm always struck that they kind of valorize the kid who doesn't participate in any of the graces that's being said around the table.
But it is a reform school.
Yeah, it is a reform school. Yeah, but what? Yeah.
Small R.
Oh, yeah. Oh, good.
Not a kid.
Small R. Yeah, that's probably why he's there. He didn't turn to God. Maybe one other clip, just quickly.
Tom?
Yep.
There are a couple things that maybe else we mentioned is that emphasized in 1938 is that by this time, not before, anti-Semitism was at its height in the United States. And also there's a fierce contest between isolationists, those who want to rearm, really basically between Charles Lindbergh and Roosevelt. And people are taking sides And patriotism plays a great role there, as does the issue of immigration.
Yeah.
In fact, there's even, in one of the films the Marx Brothers did for Paramount, Chico was annoying Groucho to the point that he says, "There's my argument, restrict immigration." It's about 1935. Before they went to MGM. I just thought about that, and I said, that would have resonated with many Americans, that line.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Didn't want Italians and Jews and so on.
Yeah, well, the 30s is, it's such a, and I'm sure you know it here at Yeshiva, is such a rich time for the study of American Judaism, because the two things are going on at the same time. It's the decade in which American Jews have never had greater public prominence or political power or economic clout in America, and then, as is not unusual, you have a nativist reaction against that. The same thing happens with the Irish Americans in the 1890s. As the Irish Americans start taking over the politics of every major urban city in America, there's a renascent anti-Irish sentiment at the end of the 19th century. After after the Civil War, it soothes off a little, and then the Irish kind of take off at the end of the century, and you see that same nativism, which is directed against parochial schools and against the Irish having dual loyalty to the Vatican and to Washington. So the same thing is happening with the Jews in the 1930s. That on the one hand you have the most popular radio performer is Jack Benny, the second most popular baseball player is Hank Greenberg, although maybe in some communities the most popular. The first, I think, for most Americans would be Lou Gehrig. Would that be fair to say? Right, yeah. But DiMaggio maybe a little later, right? Yeah. And of course the Hollywood moguls, the most celebrated scientist is Einstein. And so you got all that on one stream, and then on the other stream you have the isolationism that you were talking about, tinged with not a little anti-Semitism. I guess the most famous proponent would probably be Father Coughlin, the radio priest, whose actually his popularity sags as he becomes more anti-Semitic. His Nielsen ratings really start nosediving at the end of the 1930s. And it's very interesting, if you talk to my parents' generation of Irish Catholics from South Boston, that's sort of my heritage, they will tell you, Father Coughlin used to be appointment radio at 4 o'clock on Sunday afternoon for every Catholic in South Boston in the early 1930s, but then he moves away from Roosevelt in 36, and the Catholics ignore him when he tells them not to vote for Roosevelt. And then in the later 30s, everybody thought he was crazy. If you talk to American Jews of that generation, they'll see Father Coughlin is sort of increasing in popularity, in their imagination. And I think a lot of it is projection of what's going on in Europe and not sort of what's going on in America. But you're quite right. That's the other thing sort of in the background of all of this. And it will reach its head not in 1938 or even in 39, but in 1941, after the outbreak of World War II in Europe. Hollywood begins making, finally, anti-fascist, anti-Nazi films. Warner Brothers is out in front as usual. In 1939, they make a film. The first time the word Nazi had appeared on an American screen, Confessions of a Nazi Spy, in April of 1939. And that's really the first shot across the bow. And then when war breaks out in Europe that September, the rest of the studios, there's no German market anymore, get on board and start making explicitly anti-Nazi films and pro-tolerance films. And then you have a film like The Fighting 69th, which is I think the first film you hear the word Jew in again. And that's about, ironically, an Irish regiment. And there's a Jewish guy who wants to enter the Irish regiment, so he changes his name from Moscovich to Murphy. And it's a wonderful ecumenical moment, actually. You know this film? It's terrific. At the beginning of the film, they let him in because they're flattered the Jewish guy, wants to enter the famed Fighting 69th. And then at the end of the film, he's mortally wounded, and he's lying in a cot. And the priest, played by, of course, Pat O'Brien, Father Duffy, and there's a statue of Father Duffy in Times Square, you New Yorkers probably know, comes by his bed. And he says, "Well, do you want me to get one of your own people?" Meaning a rabbi. And he says, "No time, Father. Would you pray with me?" And so they start praying together. The Jewish troop dies, and Father Duffy, played by Pat O'Brien, recites a Hebrew prayer over him. So Americans can do propaganda really well. You know, at the beginning of the film, the Jewish guy becomes the Irish guy. At the end of the film, the Irish Catholic priest becomes the rabbi. And it tells you, of course, that in America, you know, it isn't blood or tribe, but it's ideology and values that sort of is important. And then the other film would be Chaplin's The Great Dictator. But in that interim from 39 to 41, what Sam was talking about is the isolationist movement attacks Hollywood for interventionism. And there's actually a Senate hearing in the summer of 1941 attacking Hollywood for war propaganda. They call the moguls, Harry Warner, Darryl Zanuck, to Congress to testify before the Senate to defend themselves. And unlike the House Un-American Activities Committee hearings after the war, where they fold like a cheap suit, all the moguls say, yeah, we're anti-Nazi, what of it? And Harry Warner, you know, says, yeah, we at Warner Brothers are proud to speak for American values. The gallery applauds. Darryl Zanuck says, yeah, the Nazis hate us. They throw at our movies. Our movies represent Americanism. The gallery applauds, and the Senate sort of adjourns with its tail tucked between its legs. And that's basically how the story, I think, ends. And then we move into another story, the Second World War. Do you guys have any comments or questions about any of this?
Turn on the lights. So you are not
sorry.
in the dark.
If you don't, I can show clips. Yeah.
I'm just curious. We're talking about film industry and other, but I'm thinking about maybe other forms of media. Like, for instance, the comic industry was just starting to become big then. You know?
Oh, yeah.
And like Superman and everything. You know, they were fighting Nazis and they were written completely by Jews. And I was wondering what your thoughts.
Oh,
are.
the comic books are great. With the spirit. But you mentioned Superman. Now, Superman comes out in November 1938, right? And then Batman's the next year. They don't overtly fight Nazis until the beginning of the Second World War. And the key figure would not be Superman or Batman, but a character called Captain America. Not the new version, but the ancient version. And one of the things comic books could do that movies could not, and it's because comic books were kind of under the radar of the regulators at this time, the comic books start fighting the Nazis before America enters World War II. So the Captain Americas come out, I think, in 1940 or 41, like the first. And the first issue, he's fighting the Nazis. He's actually punching Adolf Hitler in Hitler's not bunker, but his chamber, whatever. And so the comic books sort of get in line very quickly with America's, patriotic anti-Nazi fervor. America is isolationist, I think, by temper. No one in America wants to. Few people want to fight the European war. But the sensibility is anti-Nazi, by that. And you see that with, like, the response Lindbergh gets is very negative, when he makes his infamous speech in Des Moines.
Well, Lindbergh it's crossed the line.
Yeah.
Whereby he said, we'll never beat the Nazis.
Yeah. Yeah.
And not only Lindbergh, but the America First Committee,
right,
which begins in the Yale Law School, by the way.
Yeah.
But there is that fierce contest. There's a new study out.
Yeah.
I forget the historian's name, but about this between Roosevelt and Lindbergh.
Oh yeah, right. Yeah, I've seen it.
I don't know where she teaches.
Yeah. But maybe a better bellwether than Lindbergh is in the most popular film of 1941 is a film called Sergeant York. Starred Gary Cooper as Elvin York, who was the most decorated American war hero of the Great War, right? And he was a conscientious objector. A great story. Conscientious objector originally. He decides that he can render unto Caesar what is Caesar's and God's what is God's. He goes into the military and kills single-handedly 138 Germans. He's a sharpshooter from the backwoods of Kentucky, and an entire battalion surrenders to him. Yeah. So he never sold his story to the movies because he was very religious and didn't feel he should profit off killing people throughout the 20s and 30s. But he is anti-Nazi, and he agrees to have his story told. And so 1941, this movie kind of refurbishes the Great War in the American imagination and prepares America for military enlistment in the Second World War. Yeah?
So I'm trying to put some pieces together of fragments that I've heard, one of which was that there was really a split. There were some pro-Germans out there. and people who defended Germany, people who liked Nazis, people who liked Hitler. Then there's the isolationist stream, and then there are anti. So as I see it, there are a lot of sort of divisions and splits. But can we say basically that the films helped prepare the ground for Roosevelt to enter the war, so that America was much more ready to enter the war by the time it came to actually take action?
I guess I would make that the argument that Hollywood is actually ahead of most of the country with this. That they are actually being, Hollywood is never like 7 beats ahead of their audience, but I think they're a couple of beats ahead of their audience in wanting to alert America to what Nazism really means. And Warner Brothers is really the key studio here, and they start doing it in the late 1930s. That Warner Brothers is the studio that, in their films, generically links Americanism to anti-Nazism. And that's something that wasn't, of course we all know that now, but that's something that wasn't clear in the 1930s. They released a series of short films celebrating American values, and then in all of their films, most famously in the World War II Combat Squad, which would always have issued along with their weapons. There could be an Italian guy in every squadron, right? The Irish guy, the Jewish guy, the farm boy, the older guy, the young innocent kid. All those cliched types in the World War II Combat Squad. And so I really do think that the movies do prepare that ground. And there, of course, December 7th ends all those arguments. But even before that, Sergeant York, where the character is kind of confronting the draft in 1941, can be read, I think, sort of as a defense of the first peacetime draft in 1940, which Congress passed. And you guys probably know this story. It's one of the great might-have-beens in American history. Roosevelt supports the first peacetime draft in American history in 1940. General George Marshall goes to Congress to defend it because the isolationists would always say, and this had been the isolationist line since the Civil War, if America is ever attacked, 1 million men will spring to arms overnight. And George Marshall said, who's going to feed them breakfast the next morning? Which of course the lesson of what happened in Europe is by the time the wolf is at your door, Belgium, Holland, France, it's too late. And so the draft gets passed in 1940 for 1 year, right? From September 1940 to September 1941. That's just when Sergeant York comes out. And then there's another debate whether to extend the draft for another year. And a lot of the guys, their slogan was Ohio, over the hill in October. It meant they were kind of going to leave, even if the draft was passed. Of course, they didn't. Congress votes on the draft, and it passes by 1 vote. So if that 1 vote had been reversed, everybody would have been demobilized in October of 1941. And then, of course, you got Pearl Harbor in December, and that puts back the Normandy invasion a year or 18 months. So
there is a Warner Brothers connection with Yeshiva University, actually.
Oh, really?
Largely unsuccessful effort to raise money in the early, very tough years during the Depression here from Hollywood moguls.
Yeah.
But with the Warners, I think particularly Jack, there was some success there.
Oh, really?
And another interesting thing in terms of being in the curve of information, because of the president here, Bernard Revel, and because of other people, Yeshiva University was actually more aware of what was going on in Europe in the early passage of anti-Jewish laws and things like that. There's a much closer connection here than there was for most of America.
Right, exactly. And then New York especially, too, because Madison Square Garden had many, huge rallies protesting Hitler at a time in which it was just off the radar of most America. Brandeis has that same problem of trying to raise money in Hollywood. It never seems to work out. And the explanation we always have is that these guys, like to drive by in Hollywood to see their name on the building at USC or UCLA, and it's just much cooler. When they're in the convertible, they can see it all the time. Whereas if it's out in Waltham or here, they're not going to get the same ego gratification every day when they drive by. Yeah.
As this topic has emerged in the last few months or year, has there been pushback or a response from Hollywood to the extent that there's a critique of their inaction?
You mean the recent book, The Collaborator? Is that what you're talking? The Collaboration? Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah.
Not that I know of, and I was actually kind of surprised at that. And I think part of it is there's a big generational change. Nobody working in the business today has an emotional or familial connection to what happened during World War II. I was mentioning to Sam earlier, I've gotten a lot of messages from relatives of the moguls, like Cass Warner, who is Harry Warner's granddaughter, Gregor, who is Jack Warner's grandson, Alicia Mayer, who is Louis B. Mayer's grandniece, who are absolutely furious, because especially the Warner brothers. It's just, I mean, they were really out in front. They got out of Germany in '33. They gave hundreds of thousands of dollars to the Hollywood Anti-Nazi League. Did as much as they could on screen in the context of the times. The Lemley people are really angry too. That is the Friends of Carl Lemley. They're a whole group of people. They call themselves the Affidavit Families, and they are people that Carl Lemley signed affidavits for, guaranteeing their income for the State Department when they were, to get German refugees in. He signed literally hundreds of those affidavits. The State Department started ignoring them because they knew Lemley would sign off on anyone. So then Lemley went around to his friends to get them to sign on affidavits, because you'd have to be guaranteed to get into the America in the 1930s. Those people are very angry. I think the thing that surprised me is the Hollywood Reporter published a piece from Ben Irwin's book, and then a response from me. But the illustration for the Irwin article, which was the feature piece in the Hollywood Reporter, was the Warner Brothers, what do you call it? So not well, but the water tower, which is their logo, with the WB on it, with a swastika. And I thought that was just, I really thought that would get a response from Warner Brothers, but it didn't. And I think they're just clueless. They don't kind of know what's at stake here. If there had been like a Jack Warner III at the studio, I think he probably would have known, but it's not the same people, But yeah, you should look at that issue though, because that is quite striking, What?
The Warner family is not even involved with the studio anymore.
Not as far as I know, no.
They sold it.
Yeah, right. Yeah, Jack and Harry broke up over it in 1956. Jack, who was just a real sleazoid by all accounts. Yeah, and Harry was a really good guy. Harry was really a stand-up guy, and Jack betrayed him with a stock deal and bought the studio out from under him in '56. It's really sort of in Hollywood history. Even for Jack, it was kind of beyond the pale. But they're out of the business, and I don't know. The Xanax were in the business. But
where is Ben Hecht in the 1930s?
Ben Hecht, that's a good question. Ben Hecht in the is...
I mean, 40s and over he was.
Yeah, right. Well, he's writing for Hollywood and complaining about it all throughout the 1930s. He does uncredited work on Gone with the Wind. Yeah, right. Yeah.
And?
I didn't come across any Ben Hecht statements when I did my research in the press. And I know what he says, of course. He's very anti-Roosevelt in the 1940s. And yet, I guess that's why when I was doing my project, I kind of really wanted to stay focused on the 30s, because it's so easy to kind of to look back, and when people talk about the Holocaust, even that phrase. I know you teach this here. The phrase "the Holocaust" is not a World War II phrase. It's a phrase that didn't. When the word Holocaust became common parlance in America? With the movie, the TV movie that came out in 1978. It was called Holocaust. Before then, it was called the genocide. And the last episode of the BBC series, The World at War, which is kind of the definitive documentary series, their last episode is called Genocide, not Holocaust. So when you say, well, why didn't people do more about the Holocaust? Even the question kind of presumes a knowledge that people in the 30s and 40s didn't have.
I think everyone should know that there's a context here. I came to communicate with Tom several months back, inviting him here, precisely because of a review in the September 16th issue of the New Yorker of two books. One was his, and the other was by a fellow named Ben Irwin, who was a descendant of Hungarian refugees.
I think Hungarian Jews, yeah.
Who's a Harvard Society fellow, I believe, at this time, who uses the word collaboration in his title. And the review was by one of the New Yorker's 2 or 3 film critics, David Denby, who really went deeply into both books. And right on the first page, he says Tom's book is much the better. These are his words. And if David Denby says it, then it must be true. Anyway, there's been a spate of reviews, and then there was a wonderful letter that followed several weeks later in the New Yorker about the fact that from a professor of history at USC named Stephen Ross, from August 1933 until the end of the Second World War, Leon Lewis, the former executive secretary of the Anti-Defamation League, ran a spy ring made up largely of military veterans who went undercover and joined every Nazi and fascist group in Los Angeles. To make a long story short, this was funded by MGM's Louis B. Mayer and Irving Thalberg, who met at the Hillcrest Country Club in Los Angeles, Hollywood, and agreed to bankroll it. And initially it was $24,000, which you can imagine is worth today. And they continued to bankroll it. So that's the context for this, for your book and Irwin's book and the controversy.
Yeah.
But I think what really killed him was the use of the word collaboration.
Yeah, which is a kind of a loaded word. Like it's, you know, obviously you guys know what collaboration means, and whatever you think about the studios, you know, I always ask myself, like, what would I have done if I had had a studio, a business in Hollywood, you know, and would I have continued distributing movies in Germany? Would I have, like, acceded to German censorship, you know, to keep my business going? I like to think I would have been like Jack and Harry Warner, like get out immediately and say just screw off.
That's why it was so important that you studied and put in context that in 1920 there were only 2 internationally big and important film industries, the one in Hollywood and the one in Germany. We visited with the summer course, we went to Potsdam and we wanted to visit the studios.
Oh, you went to Babelsberg, yeah.
Yeah, we went to Babelsberg and we couldn't get into the studios. Actually, they were doing some reconstruction, so they limited on 1 or 2 tours a month, and it was not our day. But yeah, it was the big center of film in the world, the only one. So saying I'll forego that part of the market, it was not an easy decision.
Yeah, and you know, there are a couple of other explanations. Another film scholar named Stephen Carr, not to be confused with Stephen Ross, said that I didn't come across this in my research, and Steve's digging deeply into it in the National Archives and the Chamber of Commerce files, that the American government actually encouraged the studios to keep distributing films in Germany, the thinking being that if they're not seeing Hollywood movies, any Hollywood movie, to get an alternative view of what life is, all they're watching is Leni Riefenstahl films, you know, and that they actually encourage MGM to show things like, San Francisco, you know, the earthquake movie. Any American movie would be good because it would just sort of, you know, show American freedom and independence and what our country is like. The other explanation I have for the 3 studios, MGM, Paramount, and Fox, maintaining their offices in Berlin, is something I didn't put in the book because I couldn't prove it. But I really suspect it, and I can say it among a group of people who won't spread it around, I hope, because I couldn't footnote it seriously. And I really think that if you're, you know, writing this in a book, you can't make speculation, even though I would bet you all $100 this is true, individually. Is that the U.S. government, that the studio offices in Berlin were some of the very few independent listening posts that were in Nazi Germany in the 1930s. And I suspect that the U.S. government was informally tapping into information that the studios would have in Berlin throughout the 1930s. And when these guys came back in New York, they'd debrief them. Now, I've got some evidence of this kind of debriefing going on in the early 30s, but not the later 30s. I couldn't nail it. And that doesn't mean anything, that it wouldn't be in the files, because in those days, American intelligence was ridiculous. It was like it was nothing like the system we have today. It really would be like, you know, somebody would say, oh yeah, he's getting off the boat in New York, why don't you pick him up, have lunch, and see what he knows. And it was really at that level of informality. While Bill Donovan took over, or started creating the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, which is the ancestor of the CIA, he was absolutely stunned by just how naked American intelligence operations around the world were. I think our Mideast guy was an adjunct professor at American University who every 6 months would write a letter to the State Department about what was going on in the Mideast. This is so I suspect that the guy who could have nailed it for me passed away several years ago. I interviewed him for a previous book. His name is Martin Quigley, Jr. He was the son of the man who wrote the production code, Martin Quigley, who was also a motion picture editor of something called Motion Picture Herald, a really big magazine. Quigley Jr. took it over in the 50s. He knew all these guys in the 1930s as the second generation kind of son in the 20s. But during the Second World War, he worked as an OSS operative in Ireland under the cover of being a motion picture producer scouting locations. And of course, Ireland wasn't at war with the Nazis. And because he was an Irish Catholic, because he was Hollywood, he had a real good intelligence network that he could use in Ireland to get information on the Nazis. And so he uniquely had intelligence background and Hollywood background, and he would have been the guy that you could have turned to and say, did you ever hear anything like that? And if he said, no, I didn't, I'd figure I was wrong. And if he said, yes, I did, I could take it to the bank. But he passed away. And there's nobody else that's around. Kind of answer. Well, I hope you sort of look at movies in the 30s with maybe kind of different eyes. I'm always struck when I talk to students, honor students or whatever, about... I was talking to a class the other day, and the professor had them write down their favorite war movie. And nobody wrote a movie before 1980. Nobody had seen a film before. Or maybe, Patton was the oldest movie from 1970. And that these films from the 30s and 40s I just find so remarkably enlightening if you can look at them with kind of the sense of, America in the Great Depression or America in World War II. And I know probably in your approaches to film class, this is one of the things you do, is to, like everybody making movies today, Spielberg, Tarantino, whoever, knows all these films and kind of adopts the tropes quite self-consciously. And I guess, I really think they repay careful attention. And the other thing about film is always, it's the only medium we instinctively date. When you identify it, you always put a date after movies. And so it's a real kind of rich way to sort of like pick up the history of the time. So thanks, guys.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
What?
You have to go?